Hi everyone, I'm Dan Vach, senior reporter at Route 50, and welcome to Rerouted, the next generation of transportation. Across the nation's transportation systems are struggling to meet the needs of their constituents. We see decaying infrastructure, deferred maintenance, outdated mechanics, and backed up ports, among other things, and as a sign that current approaches to moving people and goods are too often missing the mark. With billions of dollars in federal funding flowing out of Washington, state and local governments are poised to heavily invest in transportation modernization like never before. Today, we'll be discussing some of the innovation in transportation modernization and the challenges facing public agencies as they look to bring transportation systems to the 21st century and beyond. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the transportation reporter at Route 50. I've covered infrastructure policy at the state, local, tribal, and federal level for more than a decade. So I'm excited to hear our guests' perspectives on the future of transportation. Before I introduce our panel, I want to thank Salesforce for their support in today's event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to bring in our panel. I'm joined by Andrew Batson, Chief of Planning and Project Delivery at the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation's Bureau of Public Transportation, and by Robert Puentes, President and CEO at the Eno Center for Transportation. Andy and Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's start with transit. It's no secret that the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically affected public transportation. To get us started, I'd love to hear from each of you on the about the current state of public transportation. Let's start with good news. Congress has put aside money for both transit operations and for new capital projects. How has that affected transit agencies as they try to recover from the pandemic? Andy, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's no secret that the pandemic really shook public transportation to its core. We saw things change almost overnight, right? With everyone quarantining and working from home, the commuter market almost evaporated overnight. It still has not come back anywhere near what it was pre-pandemic and may never end up that way. But what we did see was public transportation really came out as what it is, an essential service. It continued to operate through the pandemic. It got people to work, to hospitals, to places where they really needed to be throughout the entire part of it. And I think that's the good news moving forward as we look at these big investments is we've been able to focus public transportation. We know what it is. We know who needs to use it. We know what it can be in the future, which is that lifeline to connect people with jobs and healthcare and food places and opportunities that they can't get to otherwise. We really looked at, and this is what's going to come with all this extra funding, I think, agencies were forced to put themselves in a creative mindset, right? They had to start thinking, how can we continue to survive? How can we change things so that people are comfortable and that we can adapt to the needs that are in front of us? They started to look at fares, how they collect them, how they charge for things, what makes people ride public transportation, and how can we best serve that? And I think with this new money coming in, as you mentioned, it really is great. Combined with all that relief funding that the agency's got, it gives people a cushion to be able to test new ideas, new ways of doing things that they haven't been able to in the past to really adapt moving forward to a post-pandemic or endemic world where people may not be relying on it for work, but really need it for these other sources.
Hey, and Robert, what are you seeing there? I mean, what are the prospects for all the new money, both for operations and for capital investments?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. As Andy said, I mean, it's hard to overstate the challenges that are facing public transit right now. The concerns that came from public health, both for the safety of the riders as well as the transportation and the transit workforce, has had significant impact on the systems from literally from coast to coast. To your point, though, the money that came from Congress, particularly in the form of the CARES Act, was incredibly valuable for transit agencies across the country. It literally allowed them to keep the lights on. It allowed them to retain workers without having to have massive layoffs. And as Andy mentioned, it allowed them to continue to run these very valuable services that people really needed. So what I think we saw very clearly during the pandemic was just how important public transit is to moving people, especially those people who really rely on the services, as well as essential workers. It's the backbone of any healthy metropolitan area. and it's still very affordable in a lot of cases, right? So as a lot of different places are experimenting with fare-free transit and different ways to alleviate some of the financial burden on riders, it's proving very affordable, especially at a time when car ownership, both for used cars and new cars, is getting very high, and the cost for those is getting very high. A lot of us think that that congestion is going to come back as economies start to open up and cities start to open up again. But we have a geometry problem. We're not going to be able to fit everybody who wants to, or who may need to drive in places. So we're going to need transit for the same reasons that we've always needed transit, both to move people and as a way for healthy cities to function. So it really does matter. And Andy's point about it being a lifeline for those who are transit dependent is probably the most important point here.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's almost, with so much going on in the news, it's hard to remember there was a time when we were thinking that, transit agencies faced drastic cutbacks without that sort of federal lifeline, and then they solved that for a little while and moved on to other problems. So, but it certainly made quite a bit of difference. Unfortunately, though, ridership is still down in most places. You're seeing some recovery. I just saw today, WMATA in Washington, D.C. is actually getting more riders than they anticipated, but not pre-pandemic levels. And when ridership is down, revenue comes down with it. And the costs of maintenance are increasing. Let's get an idea of why ridership is down. Is it just COVID? Is it, are we accelerating more in, work from home, or other aspects? And what approaches transit agents have been taking to encourage people to ride again? Robert, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. It's ridership levels are certainly down, primarily due to the impacts of the pandemic, and then the push towards telework that resulted from the pandemic. We can clearly see this because of the plummet that happened right as soon as the pandemic hit, and then the slow tick up as places started to open back up again. And as you mentioned, we are seeing a little bit of increase in certain places, but data from the American Public Transit Association and the transit app shows that we're still at about half, maybe 60% of pre-pandemic levels. So while it's ticking up slowly, it's still not where it needs to be. As you mentioned, the low ridership has implications for transit agency budgets, since they're not paying fares. Then there's less money for operations. And this is happening at a time when agencies actually have increased costs for things like new cleaning protocols and new things that have been ushered in since the pandemic. But crises do beget innovation, and Andy talked a little bit about this at the beginning, that there's a lot of interesting things that agencies are doing to try to bring people back and to make sure that the people who are riding transit, who are dependent on it, are able to do so efficiently and effectively. Contactless payment systems have started to pop up, during this time of low ridership in places like New York and Los Angeles, smaller places like Omaha. So there are some innovations like that are happening. All door boarding, which became kind of a necessary thing as soon as the pandemic hit in order to protect the operators, has become permanent. Places like San Francisco, a lot of other places are considering doing it. Some more bus-only lanes here, Dan, in the Washington metropolitan area have started to proliferate around the country. Shelter improvements, places like Miami, Richmond, Virginia, bus signal priority in Salt Lake City. So not that there's a silver lining, but the one thing that has happened as a result of the downturn is agencies have been able to do the things that they wouldn't have been able to do under normal circumstances. But what we've seen on all of this is that there's a big difference between those folks who are riding transit rail, metro rail type services, and riding bus services. People who are lower incomes, people of color, people who are dependent on the bus look very different than the folks who are dependent on the rail systems, which in a lot of cases are the folks who are most apt to be able to telework. So as we have these conversations about transit, we've got to make sure we're separating the difference between the rail services and the bus services, and who's relying on each of those services to live their daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Andy, what are you seeing as far as innovations? Robert mentioned a few. Anything else that agencies are doing to bring riders back that you think are significant to look at going forward?
Yeah, I think Robert hit a lot of the big ones that people are really starting to explore. And I think that was a good point he made there at the end. That commuter ridership, the rail ridership continues to be significantly down, but at least in Pennsylvania, especially the bus ridership and the paratransit and the demand response isn't pre-pandemic levels, but it's certainly gotten up there, especially with surging gas prices to where they are. People are really starting to think twice. Everybody had a little room in their budget for a while. They might have bought a car that they didn't own before because they could afford it. Now that's slowly turning back. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of people look at the technology, even in rural areas. I know we talked about bigger cities, but in rural areas and suburban communities, the concept of app-based fare payments and technology that decreases the interactions between the riding public and the drivers and keeps people more separate. I think that probably sticks moving forward. Kind of now it's in our conscience, right, that we should probably not be so close to people and avoid handing people dollar bills and things if we can. It's SEPTA, I think, an interesting thing they're doing. We talked about how ridership was down and how that kind of takes revenue with it. That really has spawned this thinking about how we collect fares and what fare models are. So SEPTA recently introduced, that's Philadelphia's transit agency, recently introduced an institutional pass program where they're actually partnering with large institutions and major employers to make it an employee benefit. So for them, it's great, right? Because it's steady income, it's stable income, regardless of how many people ride. They get that income to solidify the bottom line for those employers that are really looking for people right now. That's a big benefit for them to be able to offer transit passes. So we're seeing that in agencies of all sizes. SEPTA is one of the first to kind of deploy that, but I think that's going to be something that's important moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk, both of you, about commuter rail specifically. It seems, you know, there the decreases there in ridership are the most stark because, as you mentioned, there tend to be white collar professionals from the suburbs coming in, and a lot of places that's kind of raised some issues. I think that were probably out there before, but uh, now people are wondering, why is it that all the trains go one way in the morning and one way in the afternoon, and if I'm trying to go anywhere on the weekend, I can't go. Um, how I know there's been a lot of talk about commuter rail reimagining themselves, but have there been concrete steps? Rob,
I'll
have
jump
you,
in.
have you looked at that? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple places that are starting to think of it now, and they kind of have to, because, as you mentioned, Dan, it really hits at their very business model, right? I mean, if it's your entire system is designed to funnel people from the outer suburbs into downtowns in the morning and then take them back out again in the evening, and these are the people who aren't riding, you've got a problem with your business model. Especially when we see, as you mentioned, ridership declines in some of these systems, like in Northern Virginia or in Chicago, these commuter rail systems down by 80 or 90%. I mean, it's fundamentally different from what's happening there. So, even if you're just an occasional rider, now you haven't abandoned it completely, but you're not buying those monthly passes, which was really the financial backbone for a lot of these agencies. And again, so it really hits their business model very hard. So they have been starting to think about it. It's hard to change on a dime, especially in places where the commuter rail shares tracks with other rail systems, particularly freight rail. So there's a lot of institutional challenges that have to be sorted out. But I think in the New York metropolitan area, New Jersey Transit, I think, is one of them that's thinking about this. In Maryland, how do you get to what you talked about, is running systems not just during the morning and evening commute, but all throughout the day. So you can really use it as more of a regional rail service, as I think exists in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia metro, places, parts of Europe, places like that, because it is a valuable service. It does provide access for people who need it, but they are going to have to rethink their business model of saying this is permanent.
Andy, have you seen anything along those lines?
Yeah, I think Rob hit the nail on the head. That basically sums up what people are doing. It's a challenge and something that's going to take a long time to come back from. One thing I did want to jump on there. I think I failed to mention this earlier, but the other thing that agencies are doing is kind of borrowing from the commuter rail market, right? So commuter rail always know their stations are the gateways to the system. That's how people access it. So they've invested in making them nice and friendly and usable. And the bus systems, that's never really been a thing for most bus systems, right? Unless you're talking bus rapid transit. So a lot of agencies are at the state. I know we've spent a lot of time trying to think of how we improve the way that people access public transportation and make it comfortable and encourage them to ride it now more than ever. And that's a big thing we can do with this new money. I know we keep talking about some of the new investments that are coming in, but how do we do that? And then kind of extending it, right? How do transit agencies work with their municipal partners to make sure that the network works together and that we can get people to trains and buses and all of these public transportation modes safely using this infrastructure investment, and encourage them to make other choices necessarily that they may not make when they could just hop in their car and get where they need to go. But congestion increases, that'll become a different choice entirely.
Mm-hmm. One of the other concerns that's been brought on by the pandemic and all the economic sort of conditions that come from that has been inflation. Construction costs have risen even faster than general inflation, and general inflation is a big concern for a lot of reasons in the economy as well. We've mentioned already the gas prices and the price of owning cars. But how does that affect the transit agencies themselves, or even highway building for that matter? I mean, like it seems that this has the potential to diminish some of the returns from the investment, the infrastructure bill out of Washington, and even what local agencies are doing. Andy, do you have any thoughts on that right now?
Yeah, Dan, I think that is a serious concern that we have. I know on major construction projects for public transportation, we've seen increases, 20 to 30% over what it would have been a year and a half ago. With the numbers coming in, maybe that's going to be even more than that in the future. So that's certainly an issue. More money is great, but if it all gets evaporated through inflation, we're back to where we started. So hopefully we see that come back to earth a little bit. Moving forward, I think what that's made us do is really look about how we invest, and using money at the beginning to lower long-term costs, whether that's energy efficiency, whether that's equipment upgrades, paying a little more for something that's going to last longer or make it more efficient when you're doing it, because not only is there the construction and the materials, but there's also the inflationary pressure associated with labor and getting people that are qualified and skilled to be able to do that, and keep the agencies moving forward. It's a big concern.
Yeah, and Robert, I'm interested in your thoughts, but also I know that Eno's looked at keeping costs of construction down specifically, especially with transit in the U.S. So why don't you? I mean, I don't know if those are two how well connected those are, but are there things that agencies can be doing to keep construction costs down to sort of keep ahead of the inflationary pressures?
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly connected, and it certainly matters. And inflation certainly does have the potential to take a big bite out of our infrastructure dollars. A lot of it depends on the ultimate rate of inflation, how long it lasts, and things like that. But Jeff Davis here at the Center for Transportation did the math, and he found that if we have sustained inflation in the construction industry at about 7%, it's going to eat up the entire increase that's come from the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So it really
That's
does have
over
the
the
opportunity.
5 years. Sorry, just want to make
over the life of the law. That's right.
okay.
It obviously depends if it's 2%, it's a little, 4.5%. So we don't know what it's going to look like, but 7% could be likely, and that could be particularly challenging for the infrastructure package. It's not, however, the only thing that drives up transit construction costs. And so you mentioned some work that we've been doing for the last few years, looking at why public transit in the United States costs so much and takes so long to build. First, we wanted to figure out, actually, is it true? There's a narrative that it is true. And we did the work and found out, yeah, it is. It actually is true. Particularly for projects that are tunneled. And a lot of that is because we don't do a lot of this in the United States all the time, especially for transit agencies that are just kind of are passing things maybe at the ballot box. Then they have a lot of revenue to build out some transit projects, and then they have to basically start a new construction arm, which they didn't have before. So there is an institutional challenge that has to be learned. So we certainly encourage them to look at other places, particularly in Europe or in Southeast Asia, or look at their highway departments. highways, states have done a great job at building an awful lot of highways and doing it for the most part efficiently and cheaply. And so there's a lot of lessons that can be learned for how you engage the public, for how you think through environmental rules and regulations, how you work with private contractors and labor. And so there's a lot that we can do to figure out how to drive costs down. It doesn't have to be more expensive. There's nothing endemic about the conditions here in the United States. We just need to make sure that we're using all the best practices that are available to us.
Hmm. And that could end up being a pretty big deal with some of the projects that have been sort of floated with the infrastructure bill. I mean, obviously the gateway tunnels underneath the Hudson between New York and New Jersey is probably the biggest infrastructure project out there, maybe California high-speed rail, but obviously that would affect construction there. Anything on smaller projects, or is it really the mega projects that are the ones that are sort of ballooning in both terms of cost and time?
We looked at rail construction, and so most of those are pretty expensive anyway. There's really no smaller projects, but it is the complexity. I mean, it's intuitive in a lot of ways. The more complex it's going to be, the more challenging it's going to be to keep costs under control and keep timelines in order. But for things like tunneling, which again is something that we don't do very often, we don't do them routinely, we don't do it systematically, so that we can kind of use examples from other places. We're kind of reinventing it every single time that we're doing it. So we've got to figure out better standardization. We've got to figure out better routinization in order to just build on the expertise that exists across the country.
Great. One other thing that I wanted to talk about, because both of you had raised it when we talked earlier, was the challenges of workforce. So, obviously, if you're going to build a lot, you're going to need more people to do the building. But right now, transit agencies and highway departments and department stores are all having a hard time keeping a workforce, keeping the people they have, attracting new folks to join, getting them skilled up. So maybe Andy, you can talk about how that's been affecting the work that you've seen in Pennsylvania, and maybe some ways that you've seen transportation agencies try to build those skills and keep that workforce.
Yeah, sure, Dan. So on the construction side, certainly that's an issue. I think construction was shut down for a little while there during the pandemic, and then there was kind of this pent up demand. So when we put out projects now, we're continually seeing fewer and fewer bids. Everybody's just too busy; they don't have the work. So back to that previous part, it really starts to drive up the cost too, because the volume just isn't there, the capacity isn't there. But on the operating side, we're seeing the skilled workforce issue really be twofold. First is a wage price problem, right? Like you mentioned, everybody's competing for the same workers or very similar workers. And if you're a transit agency, many of them require CDL licenses. You can go be a truck driver. Every truck driver company in the country right now, I think, is hiring and offering crazy incentives for people to come work for them. So to not have to deal with the public, many people love that customer service aspect, but part of being a transit operator is customer service, a big part of it. And that is another a burden for some. Some people love it, and that's why they choose to do it, but it certainly is a complication. The second part of it is, I know that we've seen, especially with smaller vehicles, the paratransit service, the other services that do not require CDL licenses, a lot of those employees pre-pandemic were retirees, second careers. They wanted to work part-time. They wanted to get out in the community, see people, help people that they could. And I think when everything happened, they reevaluated what they were doing, and they said, hey, I either have enough money that I don't need to work anymore, or this is a risk that I don't want to take because I'm interacting with hundreds of people a day. And that really dried up a big portion of the driver market overnight. So a lot of agencies right now are focused on bringing in new people. So the CDL requirement, most people have dropped it. They want to hire people that can be good customer service, good faces for the organization, and then we'll take it from there. We'll train you, we'll get you your CDL license, we'll pay for all of that, we'll get you where you need to be. I think that's a big thing. And also looking at creative ways. There's several parts of the country that are engaging work release programs when people come out of prison, reentry programs, and using those individuals to help be part of the transit workforce and get them good, full-paying, full-time, well-paid jobs that they can be a part of the community and a part of society. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I think we'll probably cover this a little later as well, but this workforce issue is a big hindrance to innovation. We all want to talk about new services. How do we evolve transit? What's transit 2.0 or what does 2023 look like? But it's really hard when agencies can't get the buses out every morning because they don't have the workers or they can't maintain it to a level that it needs to be reliable. So that's another big challenge for skilled workforce that's going to continue for some time.
Robert, I know you looked at this as well. Anything else that you think we should add or thinking about?
No, I mean, Andy, very comprehensive with the answer. I think that it's even in bigger places, these issues of retirement, the workforce that's changing over is a big problem because we don't have, in a lot of places, that pipeline of younger folks to come in and fill those jobs. There's a lot of issues around seniority. The best jobs, the best bus routes go to the people who've been there the longest for obvious reasons. And so when you're just jumping in, having some of the more challenging routes and some of the more challenging duties is difficult. And so we've got to do a better job at recruiting and retaining, especially younger folks. And there's great examples that are happening around the country. Los Angeles Metro was a pioneer at this. Places like Denver, here in Washington, there's a few examples, but we've got to make sure that we're catching people on their way up the ladder as opposed to have them change careers midstream, because the big problem that we have is around that older workforce that's retiring now.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of the politicians will talk about, getting people new skills and training them up. Is there enough time basically to do all those training programs? And then, it takes a year or two to, go through a community college course, and then, are the jobs going to be there when they need them, or is there a mismatch on those?
Yeah, I don't think, the challenge is so acute right now that I don't think the issue is one of timing necessarily. So I think we start these programs and have them routinized, and they're going to serve these agencies and transportation departments in the long term. But we've got to start being much more deliberate about it and working with workforce intermediaries in different places. Because even though there might be transportation or transit related coursework within community colleges, there's a whole pipeline of workforce intermediaries that are not connected with the transportation workforce. And it's not 100% clear why. I think the transportation workforce has always been pretty robust and pretty solid for a number of years. And now that we're experiencing these challenges, we're starting to see where those cracks are. And one of it is this disconnection between transportation and the workforce professionals. So we've got to make sure that those relationships are more solid as well.
Andy, anything to add on that?
No, I think that's good. And I think you're right that it is an acute problem, but it is a longer term problem. Just the change of vehicles. I hear repeatedly in the maintenance sectors, we don't need mechanics anymore. We need IT experts, because everything on a bus or a train or anything else is technology driven. It's digital. So that shift away from the old guard and into this newer, younger generation who can sustain the industry moving forward is one of the biggest gaps that needs to be solved.
Yeah, and we're seeing, people start preparing for the electric vehicles, which means you don't need diesel mechanics. And just you might need more electrical engineers. So, one area of potential innovation that I'd like to spend some time on is microtransit. It's not necessarily a new concept, and I know it's been around for a while, but it's one that is seems to be picked up some momentum recently. Andy, can you tell us what you're exploring over at PennDOT on that?
Absolutely, yeah. Pennsylvania, we've had a program in place called the Shared Ride Program for 25, 30 years now, available in all 67 counties, but it's door-to-door transportation and significantly subsidized for individuals with disabilities or senior citizens. And that is something that we have a great backbone on, and we're now seeing people build upon that with this concept of microtransit. Historically, those types of demand response services are not very efficient. They serve a valuable purpose, but it's a lot of work. You have to call in, you have to make a reservation, they have to get to the driver. With the proliferation of technologies, that we have today. You know, a decade ago, there were one or two companies that were thinking of app-based ride hailing systems, right? But now every time you turn around, there's a new company. So public transportation's really, I think, taken a hold of that and explored options on how we can connect people better with transportation through mobile devices, through phone calls, through whatever it needs, and do dynamic scheduling to put people where they need to go. In Pennsylvania, we have about a half a dozen active microtransit pilots, and we're seeing really good success in those, which is great to see, especially post-pandemic or endemic phase. You know, when we shift away from the commuter market and more to being more flexible and individual based on a transportation delivery model. We're seeing most of the success in kind of that rural suburban edge, where traditional fixed route transportation doesn't make any sense. There's not enough people, but there's enough density and there's enough people that have needs that need to get places that public transportation is important, but not for a 45-foot bus, not for a 60-foot bus, not for one of these big vehicles that's just going to ride around on a fixed schedule all day. You know, we have one area that just launched about a year ago, operated by Rabbit Transit in Pennsylvania. It's in Northumberland County, and they are seeing ridership increases every day. So they launched it about 6 months ago. Every day, ridership's increasing. They're to the point now where they're getting 4 to 5 passengers per hour on a vehicle, which isn't a lot, but for that type of a service, when it's really specialized, going from place to place, and it's growing every day, I think has a lot of great potential, and people really love it. I reached out to them before we talked, and you know, they do customer satisfaction surveys when people get off, and a lot of it's done through the app. It's almost like you're taking an Uber and a Lyft, but they get a 4.7 out of 5 is the average. So people are really loving it. They're appreciating that service, and what we've learned from all that is it's important to keep it small, right? All of these started as pilots. They started in very specific geographic areas where we know there are people that need to get places that may not have the means to do that. And they learn that through partnerships with community organizations, municipalities, hospital groups, things like that. And because they kept it small, you can keep the trip times low. People can be able to rely on it. They know they may have to wait 15 minutes, but that's okay. I'll get to where I need to be. It's not a several-hour wait, and I'll be able to make that trip that I need to make to go to the doctor's or the grocery store or something like that.
Very interesting. Robert, nationally, I know that there's been a lot of experimentation on microtransit. Have there been any sort of conclusions as to when it does work? I mean, Andy was talking about, keeping it small and local seems to be one of the takeaways. What have you seen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it got a lot of attention a few years ago because of the private sector interest in this, and there were a bunch of private services that launched in a few different regions and didn't really work. And so people love to pile on when things don't work and show what a failure these things were. But we learn a lot, as you mentioned, Dan. I mean, from these experiments, from these pilots, we take these lessons and you tailor and you try to figure out, well, how do you make it work? And the public transit agencies that are doing these kinds of experiments, again, Los Angeles, Sound Transit up in Seattle was doing it. King County Metro, somewhere in the Seattle region was doing it. And they found that the technology works, right? So we know that it's not a tech problem. Part of it is marketing and getting the word out. And Andy mentioned some great ways to partner with social service organizations, hospitals. I think you mentioned schools and other places to get the word out, because when people do use it, they use it a lot, right? And some of the pilots I know we've seen super users mostly that are taking advantage of these systems. And so the challenge I think they have, and what we need to figure out from these next experiments, is how do you break through from the people who know it, love it, and use it to the people that don't know it and don't know what it is, to get in order to get them to use it. And so we've seen around the country that marketing and communications is a big piece of that.
Right. Well, we're coming, I think, we about 5 more minutes. So I just wanted to, there's so much going on with in the space right now. But for folks in state and local governments especially, what's the biggest piece of advice you'd have as they face these opportunities and challenges with transportation modernization? I mean, or are there big or small pieces of advice? Robert, we'll start with you.
Thanks. I think being cognizant that changes are underway is the first step. It sounds trite to say, but it really is important, because a lot of us have been in transportation for a long time, and you try to get the dial to move, a very small percentage, and we've seen massive changes, right, all throughout, not just in public transit. So recognizing that things are different is kind of the first step, because this isn't your father's transportation network, and it's going to look differently. And so, as simplistic as that sounds, I think that is the first challenge, because sometimes in transportation we're slow to actually recognize those changes. The second thing is to use this time to continue to experiment. I think that's been a nice theme of this conversation today. These pilots, these innovations, the learning that's going on. Here at Eno and a lot of other organizations, we engage in a lot of peer-to-peer networking, helping connect up people with other folks around the country who are doing similar things. How do we learn from this experiment? How can we tailor it? How can we learn from things that fail? So getting out and talking to other folks is a really, really important, I think, critical part during this dynamic time. And then I think the third thing is just making sure we're connecting transportation to all those things that we know transportation is connected to. And as transportation professionals, we say this a lot and then we always forget it, but transportation is a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. So what are you trying to accomplish through these different services and operations and capital projects? And then how do you tailor the best project and program in order to get there? And then by connecting transportation to bigger issues around the economy or the environment or social equity or public health, you've exponentially increased the audience for the things that you're talking about. We can just be transportation people talking to transportation people, and that's fine. But once you branch out, you really increase the amount of people who care about what you're talking about.
Great. Andy, what would you advise your colleagues as they're facing the fire hose of changes coming down?
I think the best thing I would say is pick up the phone, right? So for some reason, a lot of people are afraid of public transportation agencies. They don't talk to them, and the best way to make transportation better is just to have a conversation, right? Everybody has different pieces of information, different pieces of the puzzle, and the better we can match those pieces together to, as Robert said, really improve transportation as a whole and all the things that go into it, the better we'll end up. From a physical infrastructure perspective, I think the most important thing people can do is to ask developers and business people and hospitals, how does public transportation affect or can it be impacted by your project? Too many times in Pennsylvania, especially, we have warehouses, distribution facilities popping up on every major interchange, right? It never fails. 2 weeks after this new 1 million square foot facility opens, they're knocking at the door of the local transportation provider saying, hey, we have a workforce shortage. How do we get people here? How can we use your buses? And too many times, the parking lots weren't designed to accommodate a bus. It's put way out in the middle of nowhere where there's no way to get the workforce there without 45-minute trips, some crazy distance. Those conversations, if they were had before the building permits, before the groundbreakings, a lot of things could be done for very little investment and really improve not only public transportation and transportation in general, but the lives of the people that will work there and will live there and need to access those services. So it all rolls into pick up the phone, ask the questions often, and really work together to make this thing happen.
Yeah, this goes to show that with all the new modern technologies going out, the old technology of a phone or even a face-to-face, it goes a long way, right? Robert, Andy, I want to thank you both again for joining me this afternoon to share your perspectives with this audience. And I'd again like to thank Salesforce for their support today. With more from our underwriter, I'll turn it over to Amir Mitchell, Account Executive at GovExec. Amir?
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm Amir Mitchell, Account Executive at GovExec. I hope you enjoyed that great conversation on the next generation of transportation. Our event today wouldn't be possible without the support of our underwriter, Salesforce. And to talk more about the solutions that exist to help modernize transportation and transit agencies is Christine Quinn, Director of Digital Strategy for Global Government at Salesforce. Christine, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Amir. It's great to be here.
So, Christine, we've just heard from our panel about the changes DOTs are going through and the challenges surrounding innovation. How can agencies prepare for the constantly changing landscape of transportation? What should agencies do to adapt?
So when you think about what we've got ahead of us from a DOT perspective, we need to be thinking about modernization. We think about modernization and even traditional approaches focused on point-based solutions that are going to work for immediate needs and then also help to adapt you into the future. Adopting modern platforms and even thinking about an overall enterprise strategy is going to enable a department to connect their existing systems, their data, provide responsive online experiences for their employees, their partners, residents, and then rapidly deploy new solutions at scale. It's interesting. We've had meetings across the country with several state DOT leaders and even key partners. And there are really like kind of 4 key emerging themes that we learned about. First is automating back office process. On average, it's crazy to think of this, but the DOTs are running between 400 and 500 plus legacy applications. So there's an opportunity to digitize and automate manual process and even paper-based process that exists today. Consolidating project tracking tools across divisions is going to be important, and then moving away, of course, from spreadsheets and email process is also going to be important. Improving internal and external collaboration. For a state DOT, there's a central office and then there's regional office divisions. So depending on the state, that number may vary, but being able to establish data sharing across those divisions and even having a platform that you can collaborate between the central office and the district offices will be really important as you move forward. So, and in addition, you can leverage that collaboration with vendors and your partners. Providing more transparency with constituents is definitely something else that we've been hearing. Having a better way to communicate out DOT initiatives to the public is going to be really important. I think one of the things that, you have this infrastructure bill, there's a ton of money that's coming out, and the public is very well aware of all of this money and funding that's available. So being able to they want to understand what's going on, how are those dollars going to be invested locally, and how's that going to impact them? And we are hearing that more and more from DOTs. So having a platform that can help you manage those communications and that engagement to the district offices, even managing social media engagement so that you can help with campaign and outreach for your citizenry, so that you're being very transparent. It's going to be important. In addition to delivering executive reports and analytics, so DOTs have a tremendous amount of data that's generated from a lot of different sources. So remember, I was talking about that 400 to 500 systems. So there's been challenges with reporting back what initiatives are happening, especially at the governor's office level, or even to the federal level. So having visualization on project tracking and planning, integration to systems of record, and being able to extract key data sources, combining all of that in a meaningful way so that you have valuable insights is going to be really important as you're looking at key components for platform decisions.
I see. Thank you. Christine, what current trends are driving transportation?
Yeah, there are actually a number of them. So I'm going to talk about each one in a little bit of detail for you. So the first that's top of mind is equity. So we have more than 40 million Americans that live in poverty today. Outside of central cities, cars are really essential for people to access jobs, but about 20% of households with incomes below $25,000 lack a car or some sort of vehicle. So access to jobs, healthcare, community, and other services can be expanded through transportation policies and programs, and even leveraging technology to help remove those barriers for disadvantaged and even disabled groups. But these approaches need to be affordable and effective. So equity is definitely top of mind for folks. Second, I would say, is resilience and security. With resilience and security, it's an opportunity to improve communications with your constituency, maybe providing proactive alerts, notifications, and other critical information. Recent floods and storms, fires, hurricanes, they've really disrupted lives of millions and have caused hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. Public officials face the challenge of making highways, bridges, railroads, transit stations, waterways, airports, and ports more resilient to climate change and other threats. From a safety perspective, which is really sort of another trend area, is an opportunity to use data and analytics to identify high crash zones and optimize project planning. 95% of transportation fatalities result from routine highway travel. So it's going to be critical to provide a safe and secure system designed to eliminate transportation-related fatalities and serious injuries. Technology is also a top trend, with technology being able to use technology to modernize the back office process and use tools to better communicate and collaborate with stakeholders. Self-driving cars, buses, and drone delivery. There's a lot of technology that's out there now, and a lot of investments being made in self-driving cars. All around the globe, companies and government organizations they're testing automated transportation technologies. There's still a critical question that needs to be answered, like, how will the policymakers respond to those upcoming changes? And it's interesting. So with technology, you're also seeing sustainability, right, as another trend. With sustainability, it's about having the right tools to track and show real-time carbon emissions data and reporting. Transportation accounts for 28.5% of the US greenhouse gas emissions, which is the largest share. So drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are needed for the coming decades. So there's a lot of focus on electrification, encouraging people to pool ride in driverless cars, electric cars. We could see service costs and environment improve from just leveraging some of that, some of those areas in adopting those areas to help with sustainability. And lastly, infrastructure. So with infrastructure, there's going to be a lot of focus on fixing the roads and bridges, just like I was saying, where we're scoring very low, and we need to be investing and improving in that. There's an opportunity to collaborate with key stakeholders and track grants effectively and provide the visibility and transparency, back to your constituency. And finally, I think with infrastructure, maintaining a high quality transportation system is going to be critical in the upcoming years. And, truthfully, DOTs are sitting right at the center of all of this.
Well, what would you say the specific solutions and capabilities that exist today that can help modernize transportation and transit agencies?
Yeah, there's actually several areas that I'd recommend from an approach perspective as you're looking at solutions that currently exist in the market. So with all the money coming down, there's lots of opportunity to better manage funding and grants. And those systems already exist. There are already systems out in the market that can help states and agencies, especially the DOT, better manage that process and workflow. In addition, there's business operation management systems where you can help to streamline a very complicated process that exists today in a DOT. And so leveraging, again, we were talking about a platform, having the right sort of technology platform and thinking about an enterprise approach. I think those are two areas that I would really focus in on. Second, I would look at data analytics and community collaboration. And we talked about it a little bit before, but in the transit space, there's a tremendous opportunity to use transit and ridership data to ensure transit systems are optimized, to meet the supply and demand of transit services. Being able to identify areas to invest is going to also be important, especially as you're thinking about demand. Actively collaborating with your key stakeholders as you build your regional plans to remove barriers, like we were talking about the barriers for disadvantaged, to help those have affordable transportation for work, healthcare, services, and even tied to community. Transparency of communication with your citizens. So we talked about that too before. There's a lot of public information that's available to the citizenry, again, just on the infrastructure bills. So, they want to know that you're investing money in a way that's going to be impactful in their area. Be transparent about sharing information and communicating, right? Building communication structures so that folks know that you value them and that you're not really hiding anything. I think that's one thing that we've been hearing quite a bit from DOTs is building trust with their citizenry and with communication is important. Providing proactive alerts and notifications or critical information to constituents is important. We have a transit client that currently leverages Salesforce Slack to manage incidents internally and share real-time updates with riders and key partners. It's funny, one leader there said that before they even implemented Slack, incident information was essentially in an endless, stream of noise and took years for them to really understand. So it's helpful to be able to break down those challenges that have existed. From a safety perspective, analyzing data has a critical component in planning and building future roads and highways. We have a state DOT customer today that uses Tableau to identify, potential traffic choke points and high crash zones along its roadways, specifically where projects are being considered to optimize, helpful for you in thinking about how to optimize your project planning and address issues. And from a sustainability perspective, there's solutions that are out there today and capabilities that are out there today, because being able to plan and track the greenhouse gas emissions so that you can get closer to a goal of net zero is going to be important. So having the tools available to show real-time carbon emission data reporting and emissions target setting and planning is going to be really important as you move forward. And these are all areas that there are solutions that are out there. So it isn't as though it's things aren't available for DOTs to help make a difference today.
Well, it is good to know that there are specific solutions and capabilities that are out there today. Christine, that's all the time we have this afternoon. I do want to thank you for joining me and extend a thank you to the Salesforce team for their support in today's event. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dan. For GovExec,
Thanks.
I'm Amir Mitchell.
Thanks, Amir. That wraps up today's event, Rerouted, the Next Generation of Transportation. We appreciate you tuning into our program and hope you'll share what you've learned with your colleagues. If you'd like to view the rest of Route 50's upcoming program, visit route50.com/events. For Route 50, I'm Dan Vach. Take care.